Got it in order.
Yep, so it's all in order. So your packs, so if you got your wines in your fridge or anything, you can bring them all out now if you want.
Yeah.
And then we're going to work through the wine starting at the top of your list and go through pretty much. That's quite nice and straightforward. And
Awesome.
then we're right to go.
Fantastic.
You guys all ready? So what I'll get you guys to do, is everyone, if you mute yourself, and then if you have a question or something, just unmute yourself. Just it saves it a bit of background sound and stuff, because sometimes when there's a few of us, the background sound joins up, sort of gets worse and worse. So yeah, but unmute whenever you want, easy, and I'll have a chat to you whenever you come on. So I'm Jeff. I'm the winemaker from Tractors Vineyard. Some of you may have met me. We run the vineyard all biodynamically. We then run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less, and that's where the name comes from. So quite a little sustainable label. We do things like we use these are low carbon bottles. So they're about half the carbon use of a normal bottle, plus they're a lot lighter, so we save on carbon then. Got solar on the winery. Really starting to do some work with some geothermal people, because I ultimately would love to go off the grid. So, really pushing towards that sustainability side of things. We're down in the Southern Highlands, so about an hour and a half south of Sydney. A lot of people think we're actually quite warm down here because, we're so close to Sydney, so everyone expects us to have the same weather as Sydney, but we're actually quite cold. So in some years we actually harvest after Tasmania, and that's just because of the height down here. I think our lowest vineyard's around about 500 meters, so we get that quite cool nights and long ripening periods, which is nice and good for the grapes. So we're gonna get straight into it. So first we're gonna try our Sauvignon Blanc. So we'll work down that list. That's our Sauvignon Blanc, because you guys don't get to see the labels that well. I'm actually not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I find it really like super fruity and overpowering. And so I make our Sauvignon Blanc in a Fumé style. And a Fumé style originally comes from the Bordeaux region of France. And the Sauvignon Blancs from that region had that real sort of matte, sticky, flinty character to it. And when I say we, New World winemakers, Australia, New Zealand, America, we saw that as that they used oak to make those flavors. Well, in actual fact, it's naturally in the grapes over there. So we thought they used oak, but they didn't use as much oak as we thought. But the idea of a Fumé has continued on in our sort of winemaking practices. So now in Australia, New Zealand, and America, if we make a Sauvignon Blanc where we use oak, we call it a Fumé style, even though that's not 100% correct because of their lack of using it, where originally the Fumé style came from. But I like that style because it kind of mellows out the flavors. So you get the same flavors in a Sauv Blanc. You get that sort of tropical and passion fruit and lantana characters, and the oak just mellows it out. So you'll definitely see all those flavors in this one. One of the things that we do quite differently with our Sauvignon Blanc is we actually do a double pick. So we harvest half of it at around about 9 Beaumais. And when I say Beaumais, that's a level of sugar. So for winemakers, or for anyone who's measuring sugar, there's all these different ways of measuring it, and scales you can use, your Brix and specific gravity and Beaumais and all these different things. I use Beaumais because it's a really nice, easy conversion. So 1 Beaumais will ferment to 1% alcohol. So that's just an easy conversion. So when I talk about Beaumais, 9 Beaumais is essentially 9% alcohol when it's finished fermenting. So that's quite early. So we harvest half of the grapes at around about that 9 Beaumais, and that gives you that sort of green apple and that crisp sort of acid character to the Sauvignon Blanc. And then we harvest the second half at about 13 Beaumais, and that gives us that passion fruit and that more tropical character in it. And Then we ferment it all in oak, which mellows out all the flavors and gives us a nice bit of texture. And it's something you'll notice in a lot of our wines as we go through them is you can smell them, you can taste them, but you can really feel them in the mouth too. And I'm a huge fan of that sort of texture in our wine. So a lot of the techniques we use, you know, they probably do lean towards that European style, and that's because they give us some more textural results to them. So when you taste that wine, you definitely see that nice, fresh, crisp acid, that sort of lantana and green apple, and then that more riper passion fruit and tropical characters in it. And the thing I find quite interesting in it is when you smell it, you get that vanilla-y character from the oak, which makes it actually smell like it could be quite sweet, but it's actually not sweet at all. But that oak really gives you like a sweetness on the nose to it. If you've got any, you know, if you do have any cheese in front of you, if you've got like an Edam or a Jarlsberg or something like that, that's a really great match to this Sauvignon Blanc. But those tropical flavors that you get in Sauvignon Blanc and that passion fruit kind of is a bit of an indicator how cold this region can be. You know, to get those sort of flavors and that intensity in a Sauvignon Blanc, it needs to be a really cool region. And so, you know, things like Sauvignon Blanc, Grigio, Gris, Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, they're probably the most common varieties down here. They're the varieties that do the best in the Highlands just because it's, you know, it's that cold down here. As soon as we start to get into some of the later ripening reds like Shiraz and Cabernet, it's starting to get a bit cold down here. I always get asked in the cellar door, what's the difference between a Grigio and a Gris? So we're going to slowly move on to our Grigio and Gris next. So I decided I'd make the difference. So if I made the difference, it's easy, I can explain it to everyone. So we're going to start with our Grigio. Pinot Grigio and Gris are both made from the same grape variety, the Pinot Gris grape variety. Pinot Grigio is the Italian way of doing it, and Pinot Gris is the French way of doing it. So we're going to start with the Grigio. So the first thing between the two that you'll notice, a nice little kookaburra joining us if you can hear it. The first thing you'll notice, or the winemaking between the differences, between the styles, is an Italian winemaker is very conscious of the food it's going to be drunk with or eaten with. So when they're making the wine, you could almost say that they make it specifically to go with food. I mean, that's not 100% correct. It's not that close of a link, but they are definitely thinking about food when they're making the wine, whereas the French are only thinking about the wine. So if we think about Italy, there's a lot of maritime climate. It's slightly warmer conditions down there. And so they're trying to create a wine that's fresh and zippy and nice steely palate, something that's going to go really well with seafood. So the way they do that, first thing they do is they harvest it nice and early, because as we ripen a grape, what's happening is the sugar levels are slowly increasing and the acid levels are slowly decreasing. So we get this sort of crossover of the acid and sugar levels. The earlier we harvest it, the more acids, and the more acid, the fresher the wine. The later we harvest it, the more alcohol and the lower acid, which gives us sort of bigger, fleshier wines. So the Italians, they're harvesting it at around about 11% alcohol, or 11 Beaumet. The Italians are not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I've got my tank full of juice after I press it off, and I actually fill a bucket with the juice and then tip it up over the top, and fill a bucket and tip it up over the top, and fill a bucket and tip it up over the top. And I do that over and over again until the juice actually goes brown from oxidized, from getting all the oxygen in there. And then I do really long, slow sort of cold ferment. And that helps me get that green apple character, but also helps me get this really nice steely palate to it and this crispness to it. And you'll notice when you taste that wine, you really do get that really crisp green acid and that steely sort of palate, but then you get a nice bit of texture at the end as well. And that's what we're trying to achieve with a Grigio style. And if you're lucky enough to have some nice oysters in front of you, you know, those beautiful South Coast oysters, they do those little oysters that are really quite sweet. They are the best match with a Pinot Grigio. It's probably one of my favorite matches. I always need to have some here with me, but it doesn't work so well. It's hard enough trying to eat cheese and talk and drink wine, but when you're throwing oysters in the mix, it's a bit much, I think. But yeah, so seafood, Italian style, nice and crisp and zippy. Good way to remember it is Italians always in a hurry, so they're the first people to harvest the grapes. French, on the other hand, make it quite differently. So we're going to move slowly onto the Pinot Gris. Don't worry if I'm moving a bit quick, because I will start talking about all sorts of things as we go along, so you won't get behind. So Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is the French way of making it. If you think about where Pinot Gris is planted in France, it's mainly up in the Alsace region, which is on the border of Germany and France. So it's quite a cool climate region. The French are trying to create a wine that stands by itself. So they're not thinking about the food, even though the wines do go fantastically well with food. That's not what their aim is. Their aim is to create a wine that's just stands by itself. And so they're trying to create a big, round, voluptuous style of wine. So a big, fleshy style of wine. So the first thing they do when they're making this wine is they want higher alcohol. So they let it ripen a lot more. So ripening is usually about 3 weeks after the Grigio or the Italian style. So our alcohol levels are around about that 13 to 14% alcohol, 13 to 14 Beaumais. And as a result, the first thing you'll notice in this wine, especially in your glasses, is you just get a little bit of a bronzy color to it, sometimes even a bit of a pinky tinge, but usually it's sort of that bronzy color. And that's from the grape. Pinot Gris is a white grape, but as it gets riper and riper, it starts to get a little bit pink color to it. And around about that high 12s, early 13s, when you just get a little bit of pink coating on the skins, when the grapes are in the vineyard still, they always get this dusting over the top of them. It's like a natural yeast cover over the top of the grape. And so when you've got the pink color of the skins and this dusting over the top, and you see the grapes from a distance, the bunches actually look gray. And that's where the name came from. So Pinot Gris, gris means gray in French. And so that's where they name the variety. And often the Italians won't see that gray color because they're harvesting it before the fruit gets to that sort of level. And that's why one of the big things when you get a Pinot Gris is that sort of bronzy, sometimes pinky tinge to it. It's because of the ripeness level. The second thing you'll see is about up here on the glass, you get this rim of clear liquid, which is then dribbling back down into the wine. And what that is the volatiles of the wine. And when I say volatiles, what it is everything in the wine that evaporates at room temperature is evaporating out, condensating around the glass and falling back in again. Now, in this wine and in most wines, that's usually alcohol. The predominant volatile component of a wine is an alcohol. That's why you don't really see that clear rim there on the Pinot Grigio as much, is because we've got that lower alcohol. But that alcohol does something actually really interesting. If you smell that wine, and I asked you whether you thought the Grigio or the Gris was a more aromatic wine, most of you would probably tell me that this one, the Pinot Gris, is a lot more aromatic. It definitely seems that way. The interesting thing is, if I was to analyze the aromatic components of those two wines, the one with the highest percentage is actually the Grigio. And what's happening is that alcohol, as it's coming out of the glass, evaporating out of the glass, is grabbing onto all these other components and flavonoids with it and bringing them up into our nose. And so that's why that Pinot Gris gets that real aromatic character to it, even though it's not got a huge amount of aroma, is because of that alcohol. Now, this is one of the reasons why when I'm tasting Italian wines in a cellar door or in a situation where I don't have food with me, So because they are designed to go with are designed to go with food, it's very easy to be drinking them without food and to skim over them. And you can see in this case, when we looked at that Grigio, and now we're moving on to the Gris, for me in particular, because I don't have food at all, it would be really easy for me to allow that Pinot Gris just to overpower the Pinot Grigio and probably skew my thoughts on which one I preferred more. So I do find in a situation where you're tasting wine without food, that is important to sort of go back and spend a bit more time on the Italian varieties. And especially if you do have food, if you're lucky enough to have food, and eat them with the food, you'll find they're really quite different. So the big difference is that higher alcohol with the Pinot Gris. Now, the other thing is to create that big, rich, round style that the French are chasing, we ferment it at a warmer temperature. The problem with fermenting at a warmer temperature is we lose a lot of aroma. So we've already lost a lot anyway, but we're lucky that the alcohol sort of picked up on it a bit. But to stop us losing any more, the French style is super, super afraid of oxygen. So the complete opposite to the Italian style. So every time we do a transfer of the wine or the juice from one tank to another tank, it's always under carbon dioxide cover. So it's always away from oxygen. And that helps trap in some of those aromas. And then we're able to ferment it a little bit warmer. And that means we get a bit more mouthfeel to the wine. And then when you taste that, you'll see big, rich, really fruity style. You also get just a little bit of like an oiliness to it, like a viscosity, like a glycerol-y character. And that's one of the key things we're trying to chase for a good Pinot Gris, is that sort of glycerol-y, oily character to it. And, if I was to put those two wines in front of you, the Pinot Gris and the Pinot Grigio, and tell you that they were the same variety, you probably wouldn't believe me. It's amazing how different they are. And these two are actually from the exact same variety, the exact same block. And the only difference between these two is the harvest date, probably about 3 weeks harvest date, and then the winemaking techniques between the two. So it's incredible how different they are. It's a really good example of how much the winemaker and the viticulturist can affect the final flavors of the wine. One of the difficult things for us in Australia is, you can imagine we got our Pinot Gris at this end of the spectrum, and then the Pinot Grigio at this end of the spectrum, the Pinot Gris at the other end of the spectrum, and then we've got all these variations in between, and then we've got this funny crossover bit in the middle where it's a bit unknown what style it is. And so that adds to the complexity of the two different styles, especially here in Australia. The other thing that's quite difficult is that in Australia, there's no label law defining Grigio and Gris. So when you walk into a bottle shop in Australia and pick a wine based on the term Grigio or Gris, it can be a little bit of a lucky dip. And I've worked for big companies before where we have made a certain style, like a Gris, for example, and depending on what the marketers thought would sell better that month, they've actually marketed it or put it in the shop labeled it as a Gris or a Grigio, depending. And so it makes it very complex for us as the consumer, what we're getting. Probably the easiest way, or a couple of ways to at least make it a little bit easier when you're picking in a bottle shop, is turn the bottle around. And if the alcohol's between 11 and 12%, it's almost definitely a Grigio. If it's between 13 and 14, it's almost definitely a Gris. If it's in between the two, then unfortunately the only way to tell the difference is to either taste it or know or if they have notes of the style on it that are actually the correct notes. So yes, it is a very difficult situation for us in Australia. It is changing. 2 years ago, when I entered a wine in a wine show, I'd enter it as a wine made from the Pinot Gris grape. Whereas now, if I enter a wine in a wine show, I enter it as a Pinot Grigio or a Pinot Gris. And what that means is, if I was to put that Pinot Grigio in a Pinot Gris class, it would get 0 marks. Even though it's a nice wine, a beautiful wine, because it's not a Pinot Gris, it wouldn't get any marks. And what will happen now over the next 3 or 4 years is the wine shows will clearly define what is a Gris and what's a Grigio, and clearly define the parameters around them. And then that will flow onto labeling law. So, you know, maybe in the next 5 years, it will be controlled by law, the style of wine that will be a Grigio and the style of wine that will be a Gris. But up until then, it's a little bit of a lucky dip. Generally now, I think more and more companies are falling into the stylistic realm of things. And so, you know, when you get a Grigio, you do expect it to be fresher and crisper, not as big and round. Not always the case, but it is sort of slowly heading that way. Slowly move on to our Chardonnay. Do you guys drink much Chardonnay? I always ask because I get a lot of, oh, kind of, a little bit, not really. Yeah, Chardonnay is interesting. It's this variety that people, I think, over the history of Chardonnay, we sort of went from the 70s and 80s where it was super duper oaky, and then in the late 90s, early 2000s, where it was all unoaked and quite fruity. And we all have these memories of one too oaky wine or one too fruity wine in a Chardonnay style that kind of turned us off it a bit. And I have this theory that we're all closet Chardonnay drinkers because everyone comes in and says that not sure, but it's still our biggest selling variety, white variety in the cellar door. It's still the biggest selling white variety across Australia. Yet, you know, we only get a few hands up when we say who drinks Chardonnay. And I think it's because of the history behind it. For me, I love Chardonnay. It's a really fun variety to make. It's almost like a blank canvas. So when I do the Gris and the Grigio, to make those wines stylistically different, I have the changes I do are really hugely different winemaking techniques. And if I'm to do a little technique between those two, it really doesn't change the flavor at all or the texture at all. The fruit itself is very solid in its acid structure and very solid in its fruit structure. And so it's not very malleable. Chardonnay, on the other hand, even though it's got solid acid and solid structure and solid fruit characters, for some reason, it's a really malleable variety. And so every little thing I do as a winemaker, you can actually taste it in the end wine. It's very obvious, which makes it fun because it's a blank canvas. It makes it a little bit scary because if I do something wrong, then it's really obvious in the final wine. For me, Chardonnay is all about balance. I want to see a little bit of oak. I want to see a little bit of buttery flavor. I want to see a bit of fruit, but I don't want to see too much of anything. I just want to see a bit of everything. And I think we've done all right for this so far. If you've got a really nice, like a really creamy brie in front of you, like a fromage dauphinois or some triple brie, that is an awesome match for the Chardonnay. Just that creamy characters of the cheese enhances the creaminess and the butteriness of the wine, but at the same time, it enhances the fruit characters as well. And so it doesn't overpower anything. It keeps that balance, but enhances it all. It's one of my favorite matches with this wine. That buttery flavor is something really quite interesting. It's actually from a second ferment. So all of our wines go through the first fermentation process, probably the most important fermentation process, and that's the yeast fermentation process. And that takes the sugar and uses a yeast and ferments it into alcohol. So that's probably the most important part. Our Chardonnay and all our reds go through a secondary ferment, which is a bacterial ferment, and that's called a malolactic fermentation. And what's happening there is we use a bacteria and we convert the malic acid, which is the same acid that you find in an apple. So it's quite a crisp acid. And we're fermenting it with this bacteria into a lactic acid, which is the same acid that you find in milk. So it's a softer, creamier acid. A byproduct of this is these buttery flavors. Now, it was in the middle of the 80s somewhere that there was a famous wine writer that said, "Oh, I am so sick of these buttery Chardonnays." And so the companies that produce this bacteria or grow this bacteria started selecting against the buttery characters. And so now when I go into the market and buy a commercially available strain of bacteria, it doesn't have any of those buttery characters in it. It just converts the acid to a softer acid. So for lack of a better word, I found an heirloom variety of bacteria, and we use 5% of that in our barrels. And that just gives us that little bit of butteriness. And I'm sure you agree when you taste that, that butteriness is definitely obvious in that wine. And you can imagine if we had 100% of our barrels using that bacteria, you can see why that wine writer said, "Oh no, this is way too much. It's overpowering the wine." Got a bit of everything. I like to see that butteriness, but and the oak and the fruit, as long as nothing overpowers everything, you want them to work together. One of the things I love about when you get that balance of that, the vanilla from the oak and the butteriness from the malolactic, and then the fruit characters from the fruit, when you get them nicely and balanced, you get these funny sensations of, you sort of zip between getting that nice citrusy grapefruit character in the fruit, and then it sort of blends back, and sometimes you get this nice sort of sweet mango character, and then you get this butteriness, and they all work in that same sort of flavor spectrum together. And so nothing's dominating. I don't use any new oak in it. I find that new oak is just way too powerful, and so I use 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5-year-old oak in it, just so I get oak without it being overpowered. So that's our Chardonnay, and I think Australia's starting to make probably some of the best Chardonnays we have ever. We're finding this nice balance now in our Chardonnays. We're learning how to make these more delicate styles that show a bit of oak, that show a bit of butteriness, that show a bit of fruit. And as a result, I think we're really starting to punch out some amazing Chardonnays in Australia. And even though it is the biggest selling variety, I'm really hopeful that it's a style that might actually become trendy again. It's kind of out of trend at the moment. Things like Gris and Grigio probably, and a lot of these newer different varieties are probably in trend a little bit more at the moment, but things go in and out. So we're slowly getting redder. Next, we're going to move on to our rosé. Now you won't see this, but well, you kind of see it in a different way. But the first thing you'll see with our rosé are these funny little bottles. Now, to me, a rosé is a lunchtime wine, and so I drink a lot of it during the day at lunchtime. Actually, I drink a lot of it all the time, so I shouldn't specify a certain period of the day. But I put it in these 500 ml bottles because it's designed so two people can sit and drink a bottle over lunch and still be under the limit. Unfortunately, I can't get these bottles anymore, so next year someone's going to have to be over the limit. But the other thing you'll notice, which you'll see more in your glasses, is this color. So this is quite a dark color for a rosé. What's trendy in rosé these at the moment is those southern France, Provence style, really light blush style rosés. I've never been one to follow trend. As I mentioned earlier too, I'm a huge fan of texture in my wines. So I want to smell them, I want to taste them, but I also want to feel them in the mouth. So to get that texture, I actually need to leave the rosé with the skins for a longer period of time. A lot of people don't realize if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the pulp and the juice inside is actually white. So to make a red wine, I need to ferment it with the skins to extract the color. To make a rosé, I leave it with the skins for a certain period of time until I get the color or the flavor or the texture that I'm after. So if I'm going to make one of those Provence trendy style rosés, I probably leave it maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours with the skins, depending on the variety, just to get a little bit of color in the wine. As I said, I want texture. So what I do is I leave it with the skins and I taste it every couple of hours until I get just there on the middle of my tongue until I get this really nice furry feeling there on the middle of my tongue. When I get that furry feeling, I press it off. And that's usually at around about that 10 to 12 hour mark. And so that's why we get this much darker color to our rosé. And, you know, I love that style. Something you'll learn the more the wines about us, the more wines you taste with us, is these are all about the way I want to drink wines. So I hope you guys enjoy drinking the wines that way as well. But it ultimately is about what I want. And so I wanted to make a nice dry textured rosé. And so that's what I made. And you get that beautiful furriness in the middle of the tongue. We also get that lingering strawberry character. And that's because this is 100% Pinot Noir rosé. And that strawberry character comes from the Pinot. I get a lot of people asking, oh, do you add strawberries? Do you add these flavors? How come you get all these flavors in the wines? Well, it's amazing. It's one of the cool, amazing things about grapes. So if I take a strawberry and I analyze all the chemical compounds in that, I will find a flavonoid, which is the strawberry flavonoid. And if I analyze a passion fruit, I'll find a passion fruit flavonoid. If I analyze a grape, I can actually find all these different flavonoids from all these different fruits. So whereas a strawberry can only make a strawberry flavonoid, and a passion fruit can only make a passion fruit flavonoid, a grape can make all the other flavonoids. It's one of the only great fruits in the world that has the ability to actually create all the different chemical components to make these different flavors. And this is one of the things that makes it so amazing. But it's also, you know, the French talk about terroir, and terroir is, you know, every different wine you taste is a representation of the soil and the climate and the people and the conditions it's made in. And that's because depending on where that grape is, we're looking at Pinot Noir now. So let's take a Pinot Noir. If I plant the same grape variety in 20 different places, you'll get 20 different flavor profiles from that same variety. And that's because the soil affects it, the temperature affects it. Every time something's a little bit different, the grape will produce a different flavonoid. And I've worked in vineyards before and wineries before where I can walk down a block, and within that one block of grapes with one variety, I can probably taste about 4 flavor profiles. So if you can think of, you know, on 1 acre, if I can pick up 4 flavor profiles, imagine the difference between all the different vineyards in a region, and then all the different regions in the world and all the different countries in the world. The interesting thing is there's often underlying flavors that are the same. So, you know, an example might be, we talk about McLaren Vale, and Shiraz in McLaren Vale always has this sort of dark chocolate character about it. And they all have that underlying flavor, which is one of the reasons you can pick that region in a lineup. But then within the McLaren Vale, every single vineyard has a very different flavor profile. And, you know, these masters of wines, that's how they can tell the difference between everything, is they've got a memory that can remember a certain flavor profile, you know. And I've shown, the guy that taught us at university was Nick Bulliard. He's one of, I think there's only about 10 or 15 masters of wine in Australia. And we gave him this little vineyard in France somewhere, and we gave him a bottle out of it blind, and he picked the region, the vineyard, and the year it was made, all on the flavor. And it's because of this terroir and this ability to make all these different flavor spectrums that he's able to do that. So I'm definitely not that good. I can maybe pick a region or country, but definitely, well, maybe within the Southern Highlands, I could get close to which vineyard it's from, but it's only because I'm used to tasting the fruit around here. That's our rosé. Really good match for charcuterie board, antipasta. You know, that was actually designed. I'm sitting now, you can't see the other side of the video here, but I'm actually sitting on my deck. And that was actually designed sitting on my deck, eating a charcuterie board. And I thought, I've got to make a rosé, a dry rosé with that nice texture to go with this. And so that's how our rosé was born. On to reds now. Well, as you can see, for me, in my jacket down here, reds is probably more suited to the temperature at the moment. The first red we're going to move on, try, is our Lost Flock. You'll notice the different labels. This was before I could afford a artist to do our cool little labels that we have now. You also see this is a creators series. So we've got 2 series of wines. We've got the sustainable series, which is this one with the tractor on it. And the sustainable series is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And then we've got the creators series, which is this one with the sheep on it. And that's not 100% off our biodynamic blocks. So in the case of the Lost Flock, some of the varieties we use in the blend are off our biodynamic blocks, some of them aren't. In the case of something like the Shiraz, for example, very cold, too cold in the highlands to grow a Shiraz. So we work really closely with some growers in Young in the hilltops, and that's where we get the fruit from for that wine. And that's why we really wanted to define what's off biodynamic blocks and what's not. So that's the 2 series. So the Lost Flock is our first red. This I was sitting in front of the fire drinking a big Barossa red, which I love. I love the texture and the nice tannin structure, and then that raspberry sort of lingering aftertaste you get from a lot of them. And the only thing is they're really heavy. So I usually can have a glass or 2, and then I find it's a little bit too much. So I wanted to make something that I could drink the bottle of in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle of wine by themselves in front of the fire, but it may have been why I designed this wine. And essentially this is GSM, Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre. It's also got a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot in it as well. And this is just my everyday, easy drinking red. It's probably the red I drink the most of. It's the red I definitely take to dinner parties and barbecues the most. You know, some people like Shiraz, some people like Merlot, some people like Grenache. You know, if you give them a blend, there's always something in there that they can find the flavor they recognize and like. And so it's it's a good one to take to dinner parties, that sort of thing. This wine is actually quite special to me. One, because I love it and I drink a lot of it, but also because of the name. So we call it the Lost Flock, which references our sheep. The sheep have been a fundamental life-changing for us, fundamentally life-changing. When you choose to make a vineyard biodynamic or organic, you're doing it from a philosophical point of view. If I take a Shiraz in a market, for example, in a bottle shop that's valued at $30, if I then make an organic Shiraz, the market still only perceives that Shiraz as a $30 bottle of wine. So you actually don't get any extra market value for being organic or biodynamic. Starting to change a little bit. Part of the problem was in the early days, sort of in the 80s, there was some really, really terrible organic wines going around Australia. And so, you know, maybe 10 years ago, if I was to put organic wine on my label in a bottle shop, it actually was almost reverse marketing. It was worse for it. That's definitely changed, but we still don't get any more money for an organic or a biodynamic wine. It costs a lot more in the vineyard to run a biodynamic or organic wine. And most of that cost is related to the management of the grass. We need to keep the grass at low levels under control. Otherwise, it competes for water and nutrients with the grapevine. So for a non-organic vineyard, that's really easy. Just herbicide it. You either herbicide the whole lot or you just herbicide strips under the vine and then you have to mow just one section. And so your cost of doing that is quite low. When you're running biodynamic and organic, you can't herbicide. And so you have to go through that vineyard probably about every week or 2, especially in our region, probably about every week, week and a half, to mow and or cultivate underneath the vines. And so it's a really labor intensive part and expensive part of a biodynamic and organic vineyard. In 2014, I think it was, 14, we had a caterpillar problem in our vineyard. And the biodynamic principle says that, or philosophy says, if you've got insect problems on your farm, it's because you don't have enough animals on your farm. And so we started experimenting with sheep. So originally we used Dorpers. We thought they would be a great idea because They're wool sheds. We don't have to shear them. Meat tastes quite good. We'll use Dorfers. Terrible idea. Unfortunately, a Dorfer is more like a goat. So they ate half the vineyard. So that experiment did not work so well. I grew up on a sheep farm, a merino farm, and merinos are a breed that are grazers. And what that means is a Dorper, when it's looking for food, looks everywhere, looks up, looks down, looks all over the place. And so it's like a goat. They do the same. A merino is a grazer, and so only looks within its feeding zone, and its feeding zone sort of down on the grass and up to about here. And so it won't look outside of its feeding zone until it's run out of food in its feeding zone. Now, it worked quite well with the merinos. The grapes hung down a little bit in its feeding zone, but we used to run electrical wires underneath the grapes, and that would stop the sheep touching them. Unfortunately, when the electricity goes out, it's amazing how much a sheep can eat in one day. So, you know, with the merinos, it kind of worked. It was another step forward, but it didn't, you know, it didn't solve our problem. We still were eating too many grapes or too many vineyards. Eventually, we found this variety or breed called Hampshire Downs. It's a breed that comes from the UK. So it suits our region down here quite well because we're quite a wet region. It's a breed that is a grazer. So in the same as the merinos, it will look in its feeding zone and not without. And it's about 2 inches shorter than a merino. So the merino, the feeding zone or the grapes sit about here, and the Hampshire Downs, it sits about here. And just that 2 inches is just enough to move the vines outside their feeding zone. And so now we're able to run these sheep in the vineyard for the whole growing period. Now, initially it was to save the help us with the caterpillars, and it's solved our problem with the caterpillars. I come from a line of scientists, and so always questioning why these things are. And my belief is that the sheep are eating the grass in such a way and keeping it at such a level that they're interrupting the breeding patterns of the caterpillars and the grubs, and that's why we have a lower number in the vineyard now. Something else those sheep did, and of course, I don't know why I didn't think about this at the time, but it's a nice little byproduct of using the sheep, is all of a sudden, we don't have to mow the vineyard anymore. They keep all the grass down for us. So our biggest expense in the vineyard has now been removed by running the sheep for the whole growing season. So now our biodynamic and organic vineyards are probably, you know, almost on par, sometimes a little bit cheaper to run. We've since then become better and better using the sheep. There's a process in the vineyard we do about January every year that's called leaf plucking. And if you can imagine, we've got the bunches hanging down like this, and then all the leaves sort of cover them and stop the sunlight. And we want the sunlight to hit the bunches. We've quite a cool climate region. So if we can get the sunlight to hit the bunches, we get better flavor development, and we also get better disease control. So we usually pay teams of people to go through and rip all the leaves off around the bunches to expose them. Well, what we've worked out is if we put the sheep in the vineyard at a very specific time, so when the berries are still hard and green and the shoots have lignified, and what that means, lignified, is if I get a young shoot and it hasn't lignified and I grab that leaf and pull it, I rip off the whole shoot. If I've got a shoot that's lignified and grab a leaf and pull it, only the leaf comes off. So if I put the sheep in when the berries are hard and green and the shoots are lignified, and I leave them in there until they've run out of food in their feeding zone, so we crash graze them through strips. So we usually have about 75 head of sheep per acre. So it's quite a high number of sheep per acre, but we only leave them in there for about 3 days. So if I leave them in there for 3 days, they eat all the grass. I then leave them at that specific period of time for another maybe 2 or 3 days. Because they've run out of grass, they start looking up at the vines and they eat the first 2 leaves of the grapevine. So now we've solved 2 big expenses in the vineyard. So now our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are by far our cheapest vineyards to run. Add to that, we also have wool and meat. So we've now got 2 more extra incomes off the exact same block of land. So the sheep have absolutely completely changed this model for us. They've taken something that is a really expensive philosophical concept and way to make wine, and it's converted it to something that is a hugely cost-effective way to make wine, and it's cost-effective and sustainable, which is, you know, now becoming something that's actually quite important from a marketing point of view as well. So it's really, the sheep have totally transformed the whole landscape for us. The other thing is that the sheep where we use the Hampshire Downs, they're roamers. So a merino will flock. And so you end up with sheep camps, and you end up with like sheep tracks through the vineyard where you get a lot of compaction. Because the Hampshire Downs spread out and they don't pack together, you don't get any of that flocking, and you don't get any of those sheep camps or the compaction. It's great for the vineyard. Absolute nightmare when I go to shear, because there's always like 2 sheep hiding in the vineyard somewhere. And I did a tour last week, and these people are going, wow, what's wrong with those 2 sheep? They're huge sheep. Well, they're the 2 that last year got missed from shearing, and their wool's like this, and so they look ginormous. But it's a nightmare when I shear. Great for the vineyard. And it reminded me of the barrels in the winery. So I stack all the barrels according to their variety, or the Shiraz together, or the Merlot together, or the Cabernet together. And because this is a blend, the stacks were all over the winery. And it reminded me of the sheep all over the vineyard. And so that's why we call this the Lost Flop. So that's my very long story on the name of the wine. But the sheep really are super important to us. And I can rabbit on about how great the sheep are for ages and ages. And I really believe over the next 10 or 15 years, there will be a massive shift of big commercial companies across to these techniques of being sustainable production. And, you know, I did an article about 2 years ago on the Land radio station. And since then, the companies that have been contacting us to learn about our techniques and the way we do things, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, the stopping point for a lot of these big companies previously has been this cost factor. But now that we've removed that cost factor and added these extra income streams, we've totally changed that. And I do believe we'll see a big shift. I've also started doing a bit of work with an environmental scientist friend of mine. And what we're doing is we measured the carbon. So a normal vineyard, for example, that has been using herbicide for years, has no ground cover. We'll take a base carbon level of that soil, and it will be really low. We'll convert to this technique. We'll establish the grass, establish the sheep, and then take a second carbon level at about 2 or 3 years in. And the increase in carbon level in that soil is huge. Now, for bigger vineyards in particular, then all of a sudden we've got another income there where it's actually viable to use that as a carbon credit, either against your own production or actually to sell it. So we've got then a block of grapes that only used to produce 1 income that now is cheaper to run and produces 3 extra incomes: wool, meat, and carbon credits. So I do believe it'll be a huge shift in the industry over the next 10 years. So that's the Lost Flop. Hope I didn't bore you talking about sheep too much. But love that wine. Really nice, soft, easy drinking, long raspberry aftertaste. Good for the weather that we've got down here in the Highlands at the moment. That raspberry character just continues on, and that's from that Grenache component in it. It's probably the wine I drink the most of, not the wine that's my favorite. My favorite is this one. As you can probably tell, the bottle's not very full. But this is our Pinot. So Pinot is probably one of those icons of winemaking because it's quite a light variety. It's similar to Chardonnay, where everything you do as a winemaker is very obvious in the final style of wine. And so you can't make a mistake with a Pinot because you can see it. This is made in a really old school, funky Burgundian style. I love those styles from France. I love those styles that age, 20, 30 years, and you start to get this really beautiful sort of cigar boxy forest floor characters. So I wanted to make a wine in that style, a Pinot in that style. we'd make so many beautiful Pinots in Australia, these beautiful sort of delicate styles that are complex and layered. You know, they remind me of ballerinas. They got all this complexity and interest, but then they're quite delicate on the palate still. So this is not that style. This is a big funky style. I wanted to do something different. It's my style of Pinot. This is a style I love to drink. It's a nightmare for my accountant. He hates this style because it takes a really long time to make. So once it goes in the bottle, we use heaps of stems and whole bunches and stuff in the ferment. And so when you put it in the bottle, it's got this real bitter, resiny character to it. And you actually need to let that settle down in bottle, which usually takes about 4 years. So I don't know if any of you guys are lucky enough to have traveled through Burgundy in France. You'll often see in the cellar doors or caves there that they don't have their newest release Pinot is probably about 4 or 5 years old, and that's because they use this technique. And I released this after 3 years, which was last year, and it still had a little bit of bitterness on the back palate. I drink a lot of coffee, so I actually quite like that bitterness, and that's why we released it. It's now that bitterness has softened out and disappeared a bit. So the French would definitely wait that 4-year period. But for me, I love this Pinot. Big, funky style Pinot. I reckon, you know, a bit of venison or some of those really gamey meats would go quite well with this. It's only just starting to get that nice cigar boxy character to it. You know, when I talk about cigar box, if you have ever opened a cigar box and smelt it, it's kind of this woody smell, but at the same time, it's like a sweet wood. It's not like a really dry wood, and that's the character I'm talking about. And similar, when I say forest floor, it's like a spicy character, but it's quite a sweet, spicy character. It's not that dry sort of acrid spice. It's a sweeter style. Starting to develop that is going to age beautifully over the next 20 or 30 years. I'm really happy at where that's sitting now. The other thing you'll notice, or you may or may not notice in your glass, is the cloudiness in that wine. So that is one of our few wines that are really natural, unfiltered. So you get a bit of the cloudiness in there. It's all vegan. I'm starting to, our top end wines are starting to go down that more natural route. So as the market is starting to accept more cloudy wines and those sort of style of wines, I'm going that way, because to make a wine crystal clear and look beautiful, we're losing about 10 to 15% of the flavor. So if the market will accept a cloudy wine, I would much rather put a flavorsome cloudy wine out there than a crystal clear, you know, and lose a bit of the flavor. So that's our Pinot. I love these virtual tastings because normally I'm in the cellar door. I don't get to try so much wine, but seeing as I'm at home, I don't have to go to drive anywhere, so I can have a wine with you all. It does mean though, if I do a few private tastings, by the time I get to the end of the night, my stories get longer, I think. Next, we're going to try our Shiraz. So this is probably the most Australian wine that we make. And I say that because, you know, Australia was made famous because of Shiraz. So we were put on the world wine map because of Shiraz. Originally, it was our warm climate Shirazes, and now we getting to get known for our cool climate Shiraz. One of the things I love about Australian Shiraz is that it gives you so much complexity and texture and interest and flavor, and it does it in quite a delicate way with cool climate Shiraz. I tried all these different techniques for years. So I've been making wine now 22 years. The first winery I ever worked at when I finished school was Clonakilla in Canberra. So they're really famous for their cool climate Shiraz. And so every time I try this wine, it just brings back so much memories of my first winemaking. And across the years, you know, I've tried all these different winemaking techniques and winemaking styles with Shiraz. And they all do add different flavors and different interests. But predominantly the thing that just seems to work the best with Australian cool climate Shiraz, and to an extent warm climate Shiraz as well, is just a really simple winemaking. It does not like to be fiddled with. The Shiraz that we grow here in Australia, in the right region, it's so good by itself. I don't want to fiddle with it much. So all I do with this Shiraz is destem it, 3 weeks fermentation, into oak for 12 to 18 months, and then into bottle. So probably 90% of Australian reds are made like that. Really simple winemaking techniques, but I think it really allows the natural textures and flavors of the fruit just to be the way they are. Mm. One of the things I really love about cool climate Shirazes is, like a warm climate Shiraz, they have all this flavor and texture and complexity, and they sort of go, yeah, there you go. And you're just like, whoa, that's awesome. You got flavor, texture. Wow, it's all there. A cool climate Shiraz, and when you taste it, right down the middle of the tongue there, you get this sort of textural furriness, and it's in this beautiful line down the middle of the tongue. And what that does is it gives the wine a lot of structure. And so these cool climate Shirazes have all this flavor and complexity and interest, but because of that structure, they're giving it to you slowly. And so they're handing it to you in a much more delicate sort of way. And I sort of akin it to, you can imagine rocking up to like a 5-star restaurant where they beautifully handing you all these different dishes, compared to, like a food court where you get all these food on a tray all at once. And so to me, that's that similarity, that texture of a cool climate Shiraz really hands it to you in a really beautiful and delicate way. And that's one of the hardest things I think is to get in cool climate Shirazes. That texture can often, that line down the middle can actually be bony. And what I mean by bony is you get a lot of it in the mid at the front, and then it disappears in the middle and a lot at the back. So it ends up like this bony sort of structure. And if you've got that structure, you don't get that nice continuity through the palate. And so for me, the Young Region, Hilltops, Canberra, and Heathcote are probably my 3 picks for cool climate Australian Shiraz that I love the stuff they're putting out and that they're making in those regions. So our Shiraz is part of our Creators series. It comes from Hilltops in Young. We work really closely with some growers up there. And I don't know why I don't drink more of this. I think because the Lost Foxer blend, I take it to parties more. And so the poor Shiraz gets missed out, but I love it. Every time I taste it, I love it more and more. We're going to move on to our Cabernet next. So again, our old labels. I was really lucky at uni. I kind of did winemaking before it was trendy to be a winemaker. So in my class at uni, I think there's about 5 or 10 of us. And 2 years after me, there was probably about 200. So I was kind of did my course before it was cool to be a winemaker. And what it meant was when we were being taught all about wine tasting, and Nick Bulliard, who's one of the masters of wine, was our lecturer at uni at the time. And it meant that if he wanted to show something special, he could bring a tiny bottle. There's only 5 of us. We all got to taste it. If he was teaching when the classes were bigger and there's 200 people, he had to get something he could get 20 bottles of. So we were really lucky to try some amazing wines. And I remember he was telling us this story where he was down in Adelaide and there was this old pub being smashed down, and he looked into the skip, and at the bottom of the skip there was this 375 ml bottle, so a half bottle on the small ones. And he jumped in and grabbed it and he brought it into uni for us to taste. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So 1956 McGill's Burgundy is Penfolds before Penfolds, off the old McGill's vineyard. And this wine at the time would have been 46 years old. And it was incredible. The flavors of a really old red wine, the descriptions that you use don't sound very good at all. Soy sauce and fish sauce and composting guava, and you think, well, it does not sound great. But for some reason, all these flavors work in perfect balance with the fresh fruit flavors, and they just create this amazing complex flavor spectrum in your mouth. And it reminds me a little bit of how you can introduce savory and sweet flavors all work together. And when I was at uni, one of my flatmates was a chef, and I remember he said to me one morning, I'm going to cook you some French toast. I thought, oh, great, he's going to cook French toast. So cook this French toast and put these fried bananas on it, and then some bacon, and then put maple syrup all over the top. And I remember thinking at the time, what the hell is this? Bacon and bananas and egg. Like, phew, this is wild. And I remember tasting it and thinking, oh, wow, this is incredible. All those flavors, savory and the bacon and the sweet, they just went so well together. And I think it's the same thing with really old wines. You get this beautiful balance of savory and sweet flavors that just resonate perfectly. So from that day, I have been absolutely obsessed with making a wine that's going to age 50 plus years. And if you think about around the world, who's famous for making really, really old wines that age many, many years? Well, Burgundy. Burgundy is absolutely famous for making, I said Burgundy, what am I saying? Bordeaux is famous for making these light reds. I got a little bit distracted because I'm sorry, everyone, if you were on Instagram, you've just been disappeared. You've just been cut off. So Bordeaux make these great light reds that age and age and age. And they develop this technique that they call post-ferment maceration. And that's what we use in this Cabernet. And what post-ferment maceration is you leave the wine with the skins and the stems for a really long period of time. So normally you'd probably only do it maybe 2 or 3 weeks. In Australia to date, the only people I know, the longest I know of other people doing it is about 3 months. This has spent 18 months on the skins. And what that does is it gives you huge amounts of fruit and huge amounts of these complex, soft, velvety tannins. And as a result, it creates a wine that's going to age and age really well. When I was making this wine, you kind of get to about the 3-month stage and you taste it. You get a Sambar tank and you taste it and you think, I've totally stuffed this wine up. This is awful. What the hell have I done? And it's bitter and stemsy and ugh. And I remember calling around all these winemaking friends of mine and old school winemakers and asking about this technique. And they all said the same thing. Yeah, we did the same thing. We got to 3 months and it was terrible. So we pressed it off, we put it in the barrel. It wasn't too bad at the end. We just blended it out and it was all right. We solved a disaster. Well, at that time, I was doing a lot of contract winemaking, consulting winemaking, and Tractors Vineyard was actually just a side project for me. It was a way for me to stay passionate about winemaking. So contract winemaking, commercial winemaking is quite boring. I wanted to do something to keep me interested. So I had this little side project, which was Tractorless. And all the French textbooks and all the French knowledge says, no, 12 to 18 months, you got to leave it with the skin. So I thought, you know what? Got nothing to lose. This is a side project anyway. I'm going to do it. So I let it go to 12 months and I tasted it. I thought, it's not that much better. And 18 months, a little bit less bitter, but flavor-wise, there's no fruit there. So it's stemsy. Put it into oak and it softened a bit, but still wasn't that great. Put it in bottle and thinking, is this the right decision? I'm putting it in a bottle and it's not that great. I'm going to end up with all these pallets of this crappy, undrinkable wine. And then 18 months in bottle, out of nowhere, bang, all the fruit flavors came out. It was unbelievable. And for me, it was almost too fruity. So I'm not a fan, as I said earlier, of those really fruity Sauvignon Blancs. At that 18-month mark, all these Sauvignon Blanc, like all these sort of flavors came out with that Sauvignon Blanc intensity. And I was just like, wow, this is incredible. Took about 2 years for that to settle down to a level where I could actually drink the wine. It wasn't too fruity. So we're now sitting 2015. So it's 4 years, 3 years in bottle, 3 years in bottle. And that fruit is starting to settle down. But for a Cabernet that's been bottled for 3 years, that's still got a huge amount of that, cassis, tomato leaf, capsicum character to it. And it's doing exactly what I expect it to do. So guys, maybe in 50 years time, we can all get on Zoom again. And I can tell you whether this experiment worked or not. But to date, it's doing what I expect it to do. I'm pretty excited to try that wine over the next 20 years or so. I really want to share aged wines with people. And if anyone is like me, it's virtually impossible to age a wine. You know, I put it in my cellar and have a few friends over and we have a couple of bottles of wine. Next thing we're in the cellar drinking everything. So I deliberately hold back a lot of our wines that I think are going to age really well, and we'll do museum releases of those wines to our club members because I want to share that aging experience with people. And also I want to have the aging experience. So the only way to do that is away from my house. I keep them in storage. One more. This is a cool one to end on. So it's called 8,000 vintages. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6,000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So a bit of winemaking history there. If you're into history, there's a really great book called Ancient Wine, which talks about how they prove the oldest record of winemaking in the world. Anyway, Georgia has this famous style called Kinsmorelli. And I was lucky enough, I spent 7 years consulting in Georgia. I do 6 months Georgia, 6 months Australia for 7 years. And this is my homage to the history of wine and homage to Georgia. It's our Australian version of Kinsmorelli. I say we call it 8,000 vintages because it's not a true Kinsmorelli because it's not from the Kinsmorelli region, but it's very true to style. And I've got cars and helicopters and everything. So I hope you guys can still hear me. So way to describe it is almost like I might wait for that helicopter to pass over. There it goes. Big military helicopter. So a good way to describe it is almost like, it's almost like a light port. It's got that like ruby port sort of freshness and crisp fruit character and Christmas cake, but then it's got that depth and complexity of a tawny port, but it's nowhere near the alcohol. It's only 12% alcohol, so it's sort of fresher version. Awesome match for that American style barbecue. You know, that really smoky style barbecue or a really mature cheddar or something like that. It's a great match for that. But something quite unique. I love the complexity and texture of that. And then you get this beautiful sort of plump berry character as well. You know, something that's quite unique. I sell a lot of it to Eastern Europeans and Russians in Australia because it is really true to style. It's really famous over in Eastern Europe, you know, even in, I think it was 2002 when Russia and Georgia had that little battle and the Russians put an embargo on all Georgian imports. And it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmorelli across the border on school buses. And it was that famous over there. So cool style. It's only a little snippet of what we got. So that's 10 wines. We do so many more, but unfortunately, a lot of our sparkling wines, I can't put in the little bottles. Guys, do follow us on Facebook and Instagram and everything and YouTube, because over the next couple of weeks, I'm hoping to sit down tonight and maybe launch it, but it will start off in July. I'm actually going to do a sparkling wine series, and we're going to look at 6 sparkling wines. We'll look at 2 sparkling wines a week. We're going to do it in the winery where I've got all the equipment, and I'm going to talk about how we make them and the history of them and actually give you demonstrations of method traditional, the way we do it. So that'll be a cool little experience online that we're going to do. These tastings, these virtual tastings, I now am going to do them forever. We've had a really good response. I actually today at lunchtime, our lunchtime today over in America, it was their evening. We launched our first American virtual tasting in conjunction with Bondi Harvest over there. So guys, yeah, do follow us on our YouTube channel as well. We post up little bits and pieces on all our different channels. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't bore you with my stories of sheep and various tangents and aged wine and that sort of thing. I'll when I leave you guys, I'll actually leave our chat open for a bit. So if you have any questions or any feedback, please jump on the chat and I can give that back to you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Please tell everyone about it and leave us a review and all that sort of thing. You should have got, when we emailed you out, should have got a link to our shop. Don't get too confused because it's not us. Our website is hopeless and we don't have a shop. And so we're working closely with a cellar door, what do you call it, a bottle shop down in Jervis Bay, who we're using their website, and they send us the orders. So don't get confused if you do jump online and it sends you to some wild place. And there's a little voucher there as well that you can use to get a bit of a discount. So guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you again soon. I hope one day you can actually make the trek down to the Southern Highlands. For now, enjoy the rest of your Saturday night. Stay safe, stay isolated or separated or whatever we're trying to do at the moment. And look, I look forward to you maybe coming down here and seeing us soon. So I hope you enjoyed it, guys, and I'll see you all later.